Instead of speaking to the rock as he was told to do, he strikes the rock with his rod. And he does it twice. Now, there are at least two reasons that may have featured in Moses' mind as he struck the rock that might in some sense make it look not so bad. God had, after all, said, go to the tabernacle and get the rod. Well, what am I going to do with the rod unless it's hit the rock? God just says, bring the rod with you. He didn't say, hit the rock with the rod, but the rod was in his hand. And the second thing is, something like this happened before, in the first year of the wilderness wanderings. Now here it's happening in the last year. In Exodus 17 at Horeb, God told Moses, strike the rock with your rod. And God says, get the rod. And maybe he said, well, last time I hit the thing, maybe I should do it this time too. But that wasn't what God said. God said, speak to the rock. And the idea is that this rock is supposed to function as a role model for Israel. God has been speaking to Israel for 40 years and it hasn't been doing hardly a thing that God has told him. And now God says to Moses, don't speak to Israel, speak to the rock. Speak to the rock and say, rock, bring forth water. And the rock will bring forth water, and I will show to Israel that that rock is far more obedient than they are. That was the idea. Speak to the rock. And so Moses disobeyed. Now verse 12, when God passes judgment upon Moses and Aaron and says, because you've done this, I'm not going to bring you into the promised land. There God mentions their sin of unbelief. Ye believed me not. So there's disobedience, and this mentions another sin, unbelief. I'll say more about that later. That same sentence in verse 12 continues, because ye believed me not to sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel. That brings up a third aspect to the sin. You didn't sanctify me and hallow me. I was the one who was to be accorded all the glory for bringing forth the water, but what did you say? Here now, ye rebels, must we fetch you water out of this rock? Now I know you didn't think you could do it, but Moses, you should be making it clear that this is being done by God's power. Instead, you were angry and said, now have we got to do this for you again? And you were thereby taking somewhat away from my declared glory. And then a fourth aspect of the sin, that word rebels. He called the church rebels. All of them. Rebels. And that's not right. That's not right. Now, many of them were rebels. And many of them who were believers were somewhat carried away with it, let's say. But the church is not to be addressed rebels. The church is to be spoken of as beloved in the Lord Jesus Christ. Some of you may be rebels. Some of you, all of us, have rebellious streaks in us. But beloved in the Lord Jesus Christ. I'll say more about that later. And then the fifth aspect is picked up by the psalmist in some verses we're going to sing later from Psalm 106. At the waters where they strove, they did him angry make, in such sort that it fared ill with Moses for their sake. So Moses got angry, and it fared ill with Moses because of this anger, which means that his anger was a sinful anger. Because they there his spirit meek provoked bitterly. So that he spoke unadvisedly with his lips. They provoked him, and he got sinfully angry with them. And God says, I'm not going to let you into the promised land. Now, these five aspects of Moses' sin, disobedience, unbelief, sinful anger, not sanctifying God's name, thinking about and calling the church rebels, these five aspects of this sin are aggravated by two more factors. The first one is that this sin was committed by a public figure, Moses. It's worse for Moses to do this than an ordinary member of Israel. Following from that, this was a sin by a public figure in a public place. Moses and Aaron had commanded the whole congregation to come, and there he is before them all, venting his sinful anger, acting out of unbelief, disobeying God, calling the church rebels, and not sanctifying the Lord publicly before them all. At this point, you should be thinking, and doubtless you are thinking, yeah, I can see somewhat that banning Moses from entering the promised land is fairer than I at first thought. But I hazard a guess that if this is all we can say this evening about Moses' sin, we're still going to be wondering if it isn't just a little bit unfair. And after I stop speaking, and maybe you think about this again tomorrow evening, when these words fall away, you'll think, well, he did a sermon on that and he explained it. But you know, for all that, I still kind of think that God was a bit sore on Moses. Yeah, it's a big sin, but did it merit that strong a punishment? And after all, he'd done so well for the last 40 years, and he put up with so much, and he was so close to the promised land. Couldn't God just, out of all of his infinite mercy, have allowed him to come in? And then think about it too. His sister has just died. And that must have put the man under a great deal of pressure and stress and sadness. And look at the place where this happened at Kadesh. Kadesh. And wasn't he bound to be thinking 38 years ago? Israel sinned at Kadesh when they could have had the land, and they're doing it again. They're doing it again. These people never learn. And if they don't wise up, maybe God's going to send us back for another generation. And yet, God did say, verse 12, because ye believed me not to sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore ye shall not bring this congregation into the land which I have given them. And God insisted upon this and did not relent, even when Moses, later on, beseeched God to change his mind. You have this in Deuteronomy chapter 3. Moses is praying in verse 24, beseeching God, Lord, you've shown us your greatness, your mighty hand. There's no other God like thee. Then verse 25, I pray thee, let me go over, let me see the good land that's beyond Jordan. But, Deuteronomy 3 verse 26, the Lord was wroth with me for your sakes, and would not hear me. The mediator himself, God didn't answer his prayer. And the Lord said unto me, let it suffice thee, speak no more unto me of this matter. I've heard you, Moses, you've prayed. I don't want you to mention this in prayer before me again. I'm not letting you in. I won't change my mind. Instead, God told Moses that I'll allow you to climb a high mountain and see Canaan from Mount Pisgah. And so Kadesh was the turning point for both of them, both the people of Israel and Moses. At Kadesh, in Numbers 13 through 14, God says, you unbelieving people will not see the promised land. You're going to die in the wilderness. But Moses thought he was going to get in. And then, 38 years later, in Numbers chapter 20, God says, Moses, because you've sinned at Kadesh, you won't get in. But the people will get in. Kadesh was decisive for both parties. And now, the key to understanding this episode, and thereby the key to justifying God's dealing with Moses, is to understand that Moses was the typical Old Testament mediator.